Aloha and welcome to SUP FM, the podcast for stand-up paddleboarders everywhere. So with no further ado, let's get out on the water and on with the show. Here are your hosts, Nick and Simon.
So, aloha, Nick.
Aloha, Simon. How are you doing? How's the ohana, the paddle ohana out there in the UK?
Oh, it's going very, very well. We've had the hottest weekend of the year so far, and I was down on the beach yesterday doing some finishing touches to our new course, which is due to be released soon. And the amount of paddle boards on the beach were absolutely incredible. And some people even had their leashes on, which is obviously good news.
Fabulous. That's good news. It's always nice to see a leash. I was down for paddle this morning at 6 a.m. It was fantastic. Beautiful, crystal clear ocean waters and stunning. Just surfing, paddleboarding in T-shirt and shorts. It was amazing. Obviously with all the required safety kit because we're all hyped about our safety course. But today you're interviewing John McFadzean, and he's been around the world on his SUP, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, he's a great chap to chat to. He's, making this incredible journey to paddle in all 193 countries of the world, and he's already progressed quite some way through that. He's paddled 45 out of the 193 already. So it's great to have a chat with him. We talk about his early journeys into stand-up paddleboarding, and he's not an adrenaline athlete. He's not going for the fastest time, and he quite readily admits he welcomes flat water, but to paddle 45 countries is quite amazing. So I learnt a huge amount from him.
Excellent. Apparently he's a bit of a writer as well.
He's a bit of a writer. He's a bit of a speaker. He's a bit of an all-round entertainer. So, I challenge you not to be inspired by this fantastic chat with John McFadzean. On SUP FM, we do like to talk about people who are a bit unusual, people who set themselves a challenge and really go for it. And by doing it, they push people's mindsets about what it's possible to achieve on a stand-up paddleboard. And this week's guest is no exception, because we've got a paddler who set himself the challenge of supping the world, which is paddleboarding in all 193 countries across the globe. And he's already made huge progress in getting there. The man is John McFadzean. John, welcome to SUP FM.
Hi, Simon.
It's great to have you on, and I'm really excited to talk about your amazing trip so far and obviously your plans for the future. But first, we'd like to start to find out a little bit about our guests. So I'm really curious to find out how long you've been stand-up paddling and how did you first discover it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, Simon. I've been paddling for just over 6 years. I started in June 2014. And it really came about because of a remarkable coincidence. I live in Southport in the northwest of England, and I have a third floor apartment that looks out over Southport Marine Lake. It's, especially in the summertime, it's an idyllic place to live. When I look over to the left-hand side, I can see the mountains of North Wales. And when I look up to the right, on a good day, I can actually see the Lake District. And in front of the Lake District, you can see Blackpool with its famous roller coaster, the big one. So I'll get some fantastic views. And right in front of me is Southport Marine Lake. Something unusual happened one Saturday morning when I looked out. I could see 3 people out in the middle of the lake, and they were each standing on some sort of large board. It looked like a large oversized surfboard, and they were propelling themselves across the water with a paddle. And I'd never seen anything like that before in my life. I was amazed, and I was a bit shocked as well, because I thought, those people, they must be crazy. If they fall off, they're going to get wet. And I don't know about you, but I didn't have a background in water sports at that time, so I couldn't understand why anyone would want to do something where they might fall off and get wet.
So what was the next stage, John? How did you get onto the water?
Yeah, I mean, this was the remarkable coincidence, really, Simon. And if it hadn't been for this coincidence, I might not have been where I am today. But at the time, my two youngest daughters used to go to a dancing class on a Saturday morning at a place called the Fitness Factory in Southport. So a couple of hours after I'd seen these people out in the lake, I took Jessica and Jasmine, my daughters, to dancing. And, they went into their class and I sat to wait for them. And I saw this sign up in the wall. And it was an advert and it had a photograph of someone standing on one of these strange surfboard contraptions holding a paddle. And the sign said, "Stand up paddleboarding." And I thought, wow, that's the same thing. And I said to Amy, the lady that owned the Fitness Factory at the time, I said, "What is this stand-up paddleboarding thing? I saw some people out on the lake this morning." And Amy said, "Oh, that'll be my partner, Alan. He does lessons on the lake. You should give it a try sometime," Amy said to me. And I said to her, "It does look intriguing, Amy, but I've not got a very good sense of balance. I'm worried I would fall off and get wet." And Amy just laughed and said, "Oh, everyone says that. Just give it a go. You'll be fine." And that was how I found myself. I think 7 or 8 days later, I was walking down the side of the marine lake. It was a beautiful Monday evening. You can probably picture the summer's evenings that we're sometimes fortunate enough to have. The sky was bright blue. There was nothing else in the sky except a boiling orange sun. And it was one of those evenings, even though it was 7 o'clock in the evening, you can still feel the heat of the sun on your skin. And I was on my way to meet a lady called Lucy, who was going to give me my very first stand-up paddleboarding lesson. And that was kind of where it all started from, Simon.
So tell us about your first lesson. Was it like a duck to water, or did you have a few wobbles? How did that work out for you?
Yeah, it was very interesting experience. So there was myself and Lucy, who was the instructor, and another lady called Claire, who was having her first lesson as well. And I was genuinely quite nervous. I really didn't want to fall in, because not only I didn't want to get wet, I didn't even know how cold the water was and anything like that. But, Lucy gave us a run through and we got on the water, and I felt a little bit nervous, but then something quite crazy happened, even though it was a beautiful summer's evening. About 15, 20 minutes after we got onto the water, a huge black cloud appeared as if from nowhere and came over the top, and it just started raining really, really heavily. It was absolutely incredible. And one of my most prized possessions is an old grainy photograph of that first evening, and you can see myself, Lucy and Claire out on the lake. And there are people walking past in the foreground, huddling underneath umbrellas. It was raining so hard, but the best thing about that, Simon, is, once I'd been totally drenched by this downpour and the black cloud had moved on, I wasn't worried about getting wet anymore, because I was already wet. So I kind of banished that fear, and I wouldn't say I took to it like a duck to water immediately, but by the end of the 2-hour session, which I think went on to about 3, I was very relaxed on the board, and it definitely was a case of love at first sight. I fell in love with stand-up paddleboarding that very evening.
Fantastic. And your experience, very similar to mine. I've told it on the pod before. It was horizontal rain and so on, but something absolutely grabs you, doesn't it? It was incredible. So sort of moving on to SUP the World. When on earth did you come up with that idea?
Oh, yeah, I'm not too sure what the exact answer to that is. The whole concept, I think, has evolved gradually over the years, but immediately after that first time when I'd had that lesson on Southport Marine Lake, I began to think about these sort of things, because I had already in my diary, I had a trip planned to Australia for the following year, so 2015, to attend the wedding of a very close friend. And I began to wonder, I wonder if you can do this sort of stand-up paddleboarding thing in Australia. I was a little bit naive back then. I didn't know if they had water sports in Australia. Obviously, I know differently now. And I stumbled across a company called Sydney Scenic SUP, who were doing stand-up paddleboard tours of Sydney Harbour. So my very first country abroad that I paddled in was Australia. My very first place that I paddled in abroad was actually around Sydney Harbour, and we didn't quite go as far as the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House, but I do have photographs of myself paddling with those two iconic locations in the background.
Yeah, that's not a bad one to start with, is it? That one, that's incredible.
I mean, it was brilliant, and I think the germ of the idea was born then, but certainly at that time I'd no concept that I would ever want to go stand up paddleboarding in every country in the world. But it just gave me the germ of an idea that anywhere I happened to go, I might try and do some stand up paddleboarding while I was there, and that led on to paddling in places like Venice and Lake Annecy, just in combination with family holidays. And gradually the idea just evolved, and until even when I first set up my website and my Facebook page, SUP the World, even back at that stage, I didn't really intend SUP the World to be a desire to paddle in every country in the world. But gradually, as the countries ratched up and I'd done 5 and then 10 and then 15, I suddenly thought, yeah, what a fantastic goal to aim for, to try and paddle in every single country in the world.
Well, it's amazing. And you're up to how many now?
I'm on 45 so far. And as you quite rightly mentioned at the start, there's 193 countries in the world. So I'm certainly not going to be finished before Christmas. I've no idea when I'm going to be finished, but I'm pleased at the number I've got under my belt, and I'll have fun trying to notch up the rest in due course.
Absolutely. And obviously, as we all know, there are certain restrictions on things at the moment, which has put a bit of a kibosh, I would imagine, at the moment on your plans. Let's talk about the countries and the paddles that you've been on so far. So you've covered substantially Europe, and you've done some Mediterranean countries as well, and obviously Australia. I know that you did a very long trip last summer. I think it was the Midsummer Night's Dream, where you must have chalked off quite a few countries. How did that one come about?
Yeah, that was something I'd had planned for quite some time, because I wanted to go to the very top of Norway, to a place called Hammerfest, which is the most northerly mainland city in the world. And what attracted me to that was the idea that far north, when you're inside the Arctic Circle, it's called the land of the midnight sun, and it is genuinely daylight there. The whole from one day to the next, it doesn't get dark in the summertime; it just remains daylight. And I had this idea to go stand up paddleboarding at midnight on the longest day of the year in the land of the midnight sun, I just thought it'd be a really funny and interesting and cool thing to do. And then I thought, well, how am I going to get to Hammerfest? And I had this idea of just setting off on a sort of driving and camping trip. So I drove, across the channel from Dover to Calais, and then I drove up through France, Belgium, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and got up to Hammerfest. And I reached there on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. And yeah, it was an absolutely incredible experience. But I don't mind admitting I was quite afraid when I went out in that paddle, because although I believed I was wearing the correct clothing for the weather conditions, the water temperature was only about 6 degrees. It was midnight. There was no one else around, and I was very lucky with the weather, because there was very little wind. The water was pretty calm, and I spent about 3 hours out in the water altogether. But I did feel slightly nervous, but I think that's part of the challenge, is to push myself into situations that I might not otherwise have done, and when I contrast what I did on that to, my very first time stand-up paddleboarding, when I was afraid of getting wet on Southport Marine Lake, and then suddenly 5 years later I was afraid of falling into virtually freezing cold water inside the Arctic Circle in the summer solstice. It made me realise what a long way I'd come. And I don't just mean in terms of paddling skills, but I've come a long, long way in terms of my own mental attitude to taking on adventures.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a long way from Southport Marina Lake. And just in terms of what you were wearing on that trip, because I mean we're obviously right in the middle of the summer here, but safety is always sort of fairly close to our consideration. Were you wearing a dry suit or a wetsuit, or what were you in?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the optimal equipment for that type of adventure would be a dry suit. But at the time, and in fact, I still don't own any dry suits, but I was wearing I think I had everything else quite right. I had 8mm wet boots on, which they keep my feet toasty warm no matter what the weather conditions are. And I was wearing a 3-2 summer wetsuit, but augmented with a 2mm neoprene vest, which I had on underneath my wetsuit. It was a bit of a challenge getting the zips up, to say the least. But once I had that on, and I then had a waterproof and windproof jacket on top of that, and then obviously I had a buoyancy aid on top as well. And I think that the buoyancy aid is the key to paddling in those sort of conditions, because obviously if you go into the water and it's that cold, you're susceptible to something called cold water shock, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Simon. And
more familiar than you would know. I was actually a research subject in the world expert in cold water shock, Mike Tipton, experimental thing. So I had the honour of floating in, I think it was 12 degrees water, something like that, for up to 2 hours at a time until my body temperature dropped. I mean, again, that wasn't testing cold water shock necessarily. But it was just about body cooling and hypothermia and so on. So it was the best paid, but also the worst student job I ever had. So, but I know the guy fairly well, Mike Tipton, because I used to play rugby with him back in the day. So all of us guys went and were experimental subjects. But yeah, I mean, cold water shock, I think, having the PFD, obviously the advice is that when you hit the water, you obviously have that involuntary gasp if there's a big sort of difference between what you're used to and the temperature of the water. And the idea is that you want to try and stay above the water if you can, and then the PFD obviously helps you to float it out until you get your breath back and you can climb back on the board. But yeah, PFD is key to that, isn't it?
Absolutely, so I felt I'd taken the reasonable precautions, but I still didn't want to go into water that was that cold. But it was a beautiful experience. I could see it was quite sort of overcast overhead. When I looked up, all I could see was clouds. But when I looked north towards the horizon, there was just a sort of small oval section where the bright orange sun was just beating through, and
amazing.
It was really, it felt to me that that's what I'd done that trip for, and
wow.
It was incredible. And I had a great trip back home as well, because I travelled down, back down Norway, Finland, and then I crossed over to Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, although it's known as Czechia now, and then I came back through Germany, back through Luxembourg, up through France, and came back home. And I managed to fit all of that into 21 days, and I think if I was to do something like that again, I think I'd rather give myself at least an extra 7 days just to slow down and to appreciate some of the places that I visited and some of the places that I paddled. But it was a bit of a shock to the system coming back home, although it was lovely to get back home and see my family and my friends again. It was a bit of a downer. I've heard people that have been on long expeditions say that there is a bit of sort of something called post-adventure blues or something. And I think people, often think maybe you have to go away for 6 months to experience that, but I felt a little bit down just after 21 days, and it made me wonder, should I just go and run away and just go stand up paddleboarding and never come back? But of course that's not possible for most of us.
Yeah, exactly. And that post-expedition blues is something quite familiar. I think Sian Sykes on one of our episodes talked a bit about that. And she, as as an experienced expedition leader, organises things for the day after just to sort of detox a little bit and just to sort of offset some of that. But yeah, that's certainly something that's been identified. So you've been to a huge amount of countries stand-up paddleboarding. Have you got any particular favourites amongst the ones that you've been to, or places that you'd love to go back?
That's probably the question people ask me more than any other question, Simon. And I've been asked that question so often, you'd think I would know the answer by now, but you probably get a different answer depending on what day of the week that you ask me the question. But although I've been very fortunate to travel to some interesting and unusual countries, and some beautiful scenic backdrops, and the most recent place that I paddled was Wastwater in the Lake District, which is one of the most beautiful places I've ever had the privilege to visit. I've also become a little bit of a sucker for what I call urban SUP, and that's paddling in urban environments, so through town centres or city centres. And one of my favourite places is the Albert Dock in Liverpool, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And at one time, hundreds of years ago, it was a working dock, and perhaps sadly, it was topically, some of it was maybe supported by the slave trade at the time. But it's now. It's now an upmarket area. There's upmarket apartments. I think at one time Premier League footballers aspired to live there before they became rich enough to live somewhere even more wealthy. But it's now got sort of shops and art galleries, and and the nice restaurants on it. But it's also a beautiful place just to paddle around. I've been there a couple of times. Once with my two youngest daughters, who were amazed at the absolute number of jellyfish that you see in the water. So you wouldn't want to fall in there, but it's a beautiful place. Other urban environments, I would recommend anyone, if you get the chance, to go and paddle round Cambridge, what's called the backs of Cambridge. It takes you around the back of all the universities there. I don't know if you know Cambridge at all, Simon.
Yeah.
And it's a bit like you pass all the colleges like King's College, Cambridge, and certainly your podcast listeners in the UK will probably be familiar with a TV programme called University Challenge, which is a very, very difficult quiz show. I don't very often get any of the questions right, but you're just paddling down there and seeing the names of all the colleges. It brought that back. But I think my favourite urban supplication has got to be Venice. I think it's just such an iconic place to paddle. I think everyone in the world must be aware and have seen photographs of the canals of Venice. And I was holidaying with family in the area a few years ago, and I just couldn't resist. But we actually booked a trip round Venice. Normally I would take my own SUP board wherever I went and, just do my own thing. But I think a place like Venice, there's so many rules and regulations, and the waterways were very, very busy indeed. So I think ultimately, I think everywhere I've paddled in the whole world, I think so far anyway, I think Venice is takes top position.
Brilliant. Yeah, and it is very, very busy. So I presume you went sort of around the backwaters, did you, or did they take you down the Grand Canal?
Yeah, you're not allowed to. Basically, the waterways in Venice fall into three categories. There's some of them that you're just not allowed to paddle on at any time, with one exception. I think they have a couple of events. In Venice. I think there's two events. There's what's called the Venice Crossing or something, and there's another one called the Vonga Longa. But apart from those days of the year, you're not allowed to paddle in the Grand Canal at all. Then they have other waterways that you're allowed to paddle on sometimes, but it depends what day of the week it is and what time of the day it is. And then there are other canals that you can paddle on anytime. But as an outsider, you don't really know this, which is why I thought it was wise to book an excursion with it was a company called SUP in Venice that we used. And, we met them a little bit outside of the city centre. You're absolutely right. The centre of Venice can be absolutely jam-packed with visitors and tourists. And, especially when they were having cruise ships visiting, it was absolutely packed. But you only have to walk for about 5 minutes away from the city centre, and you're in quiet streets, you're in quiet alleyways, and you're in relatively quiet waterways, but there's still a lot of traffic about, and we certainly had to negotiate past, gondolas, and I don't think the gondoliers necessarily approve of stand-up paddleboarding because they've had those waterways to themselves for hundreds of years, and suddenly a new sport's arrived of
Yeah.
people standing in a paddleboard and perhaps paddling a bit too slowly and going in their way. So yes, to answer your question, we kept well and truly to the backways. But I do have my eye on that event that I mentioned earlier on called the Vonga Longa, which is an opportunity, something open to all sorts of paddle crafts, and it's an opportunity to get onto the Grand Canal once a year.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that sort of come out already is the value of local knowledge, and certainly, in Sydney and in Venice and anywhere, whenever you're paddling anywhere for the first time, there is that challenge of finding out about local conditions, isn't there? I mean, if it's a sort of flat and smooth lake, then fair dues, but anything with any movement or any other traffic, it's always really important to get the real skinny on how that operates. And I think, particularly Venice, that was an inspired thing to go with a local company, because they can show you all of the shortcuts and so on. So John, don't want to concentrate too much on Italy, but you've also paddled in one of my most favourite places in the world, which is the west coast, and a place called Cinque Terre. And for those people who don't know Cinque Terre, it always pops up in lots of these sort of iconic adverts for Guinness and Paco Rabanne and so on. Just tell us a little bit about paddling from Levanto through to Cinque Terre, because we'll put some photos on. It is the most spectacular sight and the most spectacular trip. And I'm jealous, if I'm frank.
Well, if you're jealous, hopefully when lockdown's over, Simon, maybe you can go and paddle there. Maybe we can go and paddle there sometime. But yeah, for any listeners that don't know Cinque Terre, and I'm doing my best to get the pronunciation correct there. If there are any native Italian speakers listening, I apologise for any mangling I'm about to do of the Italian language. But it's another UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's one of the most beautiful and idyllic locations I've ever been. I first visited there, I think about 7 years ago. It was before I'd even heard of stand-up paddleboarding, and I did a day trip from Florence where we got on a bus with a tour operator and drove up to Cinque Terre, which translates as the five lands. It's five sort of small coastal villages, and each one's unique in its own way. And during that tour, it was partly a bus tour, partly a walking tour, partly a boat tour. We also did a little bit of it by train as well, because there's a train line that runs all along that coast. And once I got into sort of stand-up paddle boarding and I began to follow my dream to paddle in every country in the world, I just had this desire to paddle Cinque Terre, and I did it in a day. It was probably one of the most incredible stand-up paddleboarding days of my entire life. But the weather conditions were so changeable throughout the day. I got on the water about 8 o'clock in the morning in a small place called Levanto, which is about 5 or 6 kilometres north of Cinque Terre, and conditions were just perfect at that time. The sun was just creeping up above the mountains behind the beach, and you'll probably know this feeling yourself, Simon. But I just looked out at the sea, and it was completely flat with just a few tiny, gentle waves. Some small swell, and to me, that's just perfect conditions. I don't mind paddling in waves, but I've got a strong preference for flat water paddling. I know some people look at it the other way and they might think what I do is boring and they'd rather be out on 6-foot waves or something. But that's not my idea of fun. I'm a strong preference for flat water, so it was absolutely perfect. And I paddled around a headland to the first of the villages, which is Monte Rosso al Mare, and I pulled up there and got off, and I stopped for a bit longer than I planned, really. But I stopped and I had a cappuccino and a pan au chocolat for my breakfast, and then I treated myself to another one. I thought I better carb up for the
Absolutely,
journey
very
ahead.
important.
That was just my excuse for being greedy, I think.
Well, carb loading is actually a sporting term, and I'm a big fan of it. So yeah.
Oh well, yeah, I feel a bit better about myself then. As I run through this journey, I'll let you know if it's some more carb upping I did at lunchtime and in the afternoon as well. So I certainly got the carbs in that day. But by the time I got back on the water and I was heading round to Vernazza, the wind was really starting to get up and the swell, and I managed to stay on my feet during that leg of the journey, but I was struggling at a few points. And by the time I got to Vernazza, which is the next village down, it was lunchtime. So I popped up onto the square and ordered a huge bowl of pasta. And maybe I shouldn't have done, but I also ordered a large glass of Pinot Grigio. And I took my paddle up with me, and I'd left my board on the small beach, but everybody could see that I was dressed differently to all of the other tourists. I was wearing a long john wetsuit and a rash vest, and I had a paddle with me and a couple of dry bags with my valuables in it. So I think I stood out from most of the tourists in Cinque Terre. And the waiter came to me and he said, "Are you kayaking?" And I said, No, I'm stand-up paddleboarding. And he said, "Oh, I'm a kayaker. I love paddling on this coast." So I said to him, "I can see the wind and the swell are starting to get up a little bit. I'm hoping it's going to die off when I get back on the water." And the waiter, he shook his head sadly and said, "No, I'm sorry, it's going to get worse." So maybe I should have had another glass of Pinot Grigio at that point. I don't know, but he was right, because I got back on the water, and the next village down is Corniglia, which sits up about 100 metres up at the top of a cliff on a headland, and I really didn't fancy walking or climbing up that cliff, so I decided to bypass Corniglia and go straight on to Manarola. But that maybe, again, 5 or 6 kilometre section, it was some of the worst water conditions I've ever paddled in. I had to spend, most of that journey I spent on my knees. And I don't even know if this is possible, but the wind seemed to be blowing from one direction but gusting from a different direction, and I was just being buffeted all over the place. And I managed to paddle on my knees, but at one time I thought I was going to have to sort of get down and get prone. But then again, the weather just changes so fast in that part of the world. I believe it's a well-known phenomenon there, that the wind can change, and it went from a strong onshore wind, and I was battling against that, and then it turned to offshore wind. So I managed to get right in under the cliffs, and it was obviously, when the wind was offshore, I was quite sheltered in there. So I made it to Manarola, got off the water at Manarola. Talking about carving up, I treated myself to a gelato with 2 scoops of gelato in it, and I just sat. And I've got to be honest, during the hardest part of that, I did consider, should I cancel the rest of this trip? Should I get off the water? Am I a strong enough paddler to deal with this? But the conclusion I came to was that I was capable of pushing through it, and I'm really glad I did, because the weather conditions became really benign again as I paddled on. And the final town, or the final village, you'll probably know, is called Rio Maggiore. And by the time I reached there, the water was completely flat again, and the sun was just sort of setting behind me, and I've got very, very fond recollections of just standing on my board, about 50 metres offshore, just sort of gently bobbing up and down, and the sun was going down behind me, and there were hundreds of tourists just lining the tops of the cliffs looking out, and somebody was buzzing me with a drone. I was trying to find out who it was, not to complain, but if I'd found who it was, I would have just asked them if they could share some of the footage with me. And going from 4 hours prior to that, I'd been wondering whether I should cancel the trip and get off the water. By the time sunset came, I wanted to just stay there forever. I don't know if you can relate to that feeling.
Oh God, absolutely. Yeah, no, I was totally with you on the water there, John. It hasn't dampened my enthusiasm to get out to Cinque Terre at all.
Brilliant. That trip kind of ended in not a strange way, but I mentioned earlier on there's a train line that runs all the way down that coast. So I got the train back to Levanto, of what had taken me, I think, about a 10-hour journey to travel 16 kilometres down the coast. I got back up the coast in 30 minutes on the train.
Incredible, and that's a really nice train line, isn't it? I've travelled that a couple of times as well. So just, you talked about train travel and so on. Obviously, your various trips have taken various forms. What are your sort of? So I presume you've obviously gone with your board in the car. You've flown with your board. You've travelled with it on the train. What are the sort of considerations, particularly around air travel? What's your normal way of operating if you're, say, flying to a location to paddle?
Yeah, I think we're very fortunate that we now have this sort of technology in inflatable stand-up paddle boards that makes international travel and especially flying work. And I think just for historical reasons, I'm a big fan of red paddle. I own 3 red paddle boards. I just bought another one yesterday. I don't know how many stand-up paddle boards one person actually requires, but my go-to board for flying is the red paddle 11 Sport, which rolls up very, very nicely and very, very tightly around the 2-cylinder pump. I can get the 3-piece paddle in and a few other bits of equipment as well. I try and wrap everything up inside, a neoprene wetsuit or a neoprene vest and get all my dry bags in there. And it all fits nicely into the rucksack, although it's pretty heavy by the time you've got everything in there. So I'm grateful for the fact that it's got wheels on the back. And, people often ask me, what do you do about flying with your SUP equipment? Do you just book it in as hold luggage? Do you have to book it in as sports equipment? And, do airlines mind? I mean, I've flown, I probably can't list them all from memory, but I've flown around Europe, certainly, with most of the airlines, EasyJet, Ryanair, Lufthansa, Croatia Airlines, Jet2, British Airways, I mentioned Lufthansa already, KLM. I've flown with most of the airlines that you'll have heard of. I've never had any problems. Sometimes people ask what's in it, but I've always just booked it on as normal hold luggage, and I've always been allowed to fly with it. Sometimes, the airline will ask you to take it to the oversized check-in desk because it's too big to go down the little conveyor belts at the normal check-in place. But I've never had any major issues with flying and taking my gear on airplanes. And if anybody's thinking of doing it, I would encourage them just to go ahead. Just jump on the plane with your board. There's a lot of equipment with stand-up paddle boarding. It makes it difficult to get round. But you mentioned trains, aeroplanes. I've also been on ferries. I've also travelled around in a few parts of my journey by bus, which is interesting. And
Wow.
I guess my favourite would be car, because you can put so much more equipment in your car. You can get all of your SUP equipment. You can put a spare paddle in. You can put your tent in. But you can obviously get so much further with flying as well.
In terms of like challenging conditions and hairy conditions on your various adventures, would Cinque Terre be the one, or have you ever come into any other situations you had to manage?
Yeah, I mean that's probably the most difficult. That was the one time that I felt closest to giving up. I don't think I've had other conditions where it's just been so windy that I haven't been able to paddle into it, but I think that's different, because if the wind's so strong that you physically can't paddle into it, then you just can't paddle into it. And I've had that a couple of times, and it's made me feel, bad that I've been unable to physically paddle into it. But I think sometimes you just have to accept
Absolutely.
what your limitations are. So I wouldn't call those challenging conditions. I would just say they were impossible. But Cinque Terre has certainly been the closest I've come to packing it in.
Yeah, I mean it's difficult there because you've got. I would imagine you've got the complication of the summer breezes, coming in, and it's a hot area.
Yeah.
You've got the swell, you've got the cliffs, you've got the swell maybe bouncing back off the cliffs. You've basically got everything going on.
There was everything, and you've obviously paddled past cliffs yourself, Simon, to describe that swell coming back, because that was exactly what it was like, and you want to, depending on the wind direction, you might want to paddle fairly close to the cliffs, but of course, if you get too close, you're buffeted in every direction at once.
It's a toughie. The country which I've paddled a bit in, and I know you have as well, is France. And I see that you paddled a bit of the Canal du Midi. That's a canal which I have massive aspirations to do end to end. So just tell me a little bit about that trip.
Yeah, I'm so glad that that's one of your aspirations, because it's one of mine as well, Simon. I think that would be a fantastic stretch to paddle, because it's really, really beautiful there. I only paddled quite a small stretch there. I was holidaying there with family, with my daughter and my son-in-law, and I think 3 grandchildren at the time. We only took one board between all of us, so it wasn't really practical to paddle particularly far, but it was an idyllic location to paddle. Canals are the best place in the world to paddle if the weather conditions are right and the canal's clean enough. And we just walked about, I think it was about a 30-minute walk from the campsite that they were at up to the canal, and we just put on the water and just paddled up and down, and it was brilliant sunshine, beautiful green trees and bushes on either side, and there was a tiny small restaurant just next to it as well, where I popped in to order a glass of white wine. I don't think I had Pinot Grigio back then, because
No.
in France, of course, you have to drink the French wine, which
Absolutely.
is fortunately very pleasant as well. But I did try and order my glass of wine in French, but the barman just looked at me as if I was speaking some alien language, which I was absolutely. And luckily there was a couple in there who were cycling, and they were cycling that exact same route that you outlined as well, from the Atlantic coast towards the Mediterranean. They were cycling the entire length of the Canal du Midi, and luckily they spoke perfect English as well as being French, so they were able to assist me in ordering the glass of wine. And I was talking about stand-up paddleboarding, and the couple were translating for the French barman, and he decided to reward us all for a great company by pouring 4 shots of some French liqueur. I'm not sure what it was, but it burnt my throat on the on the way back down. So I like to think my pathetic and inept attempts to speak French paid a little bit of a dividend there, because I got a free post-paddle drink.
Excellent. Sounds very medicinal, that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually love that part of the world. I'd love to. I've had this plan at the back of my head to paddle sections of the Dordogne as well at some time, and that has been on my agenda for this summer. I haven't booked anything yet. I haven't ruled it out, but I don't want to sort of get off to France and then the COVID quarantine rules change while I'm there and I have a problem. But that may or may not happen. When you've got a little devil in your shoulder saying, "Do it, do it, do it." Well, I've got that little devil on my shoulder right now, Simon. But I've also got the sensible devil on my other shoulder saying, "Don't be silly, John. You can do it next year." So who knows?
A challenge.
But it's a challenge, yeah. Who knows what I'll decide? Watch this space.
Well, there's plenty of rivers in France. There's obviously the Loire as well, and the Gironde, and that race through Paris on the Seine looks amazing. There's just almost too too many places to paddle, aren't there?
I agree. I think you could spend your whole life paddling in France and never do the same place twice.
Exactly. So let's just set our sights out a little bit further. So you've been to a massive number of countries. We've talked a bit about your favourites and your most challenging. If you were to welcome some guests over from, say, the States or Canada or Australia, where would you recommend that they go in terms of must sees and the best sort of experience of paddling in Europe?
If they were coming to the northwest of England, where I live, then I would definitely take them up to the Lake District, which is a place that I've only sort of very recently fallen in love with, if you like. I'm a bit ashamed to say that some of the lakes in the Lake District are less than 2 hours drive away from me, and it wasn't until a few weeks that I actually paddled there for the first time, when I went up and paddled on Derwentwater with one of my daughters, and I also went to Wastwater, which I mentioned earlier on. And it's such a beautiful part of the countryside. Some of these lakes are sort of almost unspoiled. It's a busy tourist area, the Lake District, but you can get really away from the tourist areas just by jumping in your car and driving for 30 minutes. So that I intend to spend certainly the rest of this year, 2020, exploring those lakes in the Lake District. There's 16 of them altogether, and 2 of them you're not allowed to paddle on, so I guess that gives me 14 to aim for. I've paddled on 2 of them already. I've got another 12 to go. But, if someone was coming over to visit me from the States and they wanted to paddle with me, and I'll extend this invitation now. If anyone's listening and you are coming over from the States or anywhere abroad, feel free to get in touch with me. If you want to come and paddle with me in the Lake District in the northwest of England, then you'd be very, very welcome to do so. That's definitely where I would take them in England. Obviously, being Scottish, I shouldn't neglect Scotland either.
No.
I need to do a lot more exploring. Yeah, I mean, a little bit embarrassingly, I've done very, very little stand-up paddleboarding in Scotland, which is, of course, my homeland. And I've lived in England for 30 years now, but that's no excuse for not doing some paddling in Scotland. And later this year, I'm planning to do a trip called the Great Glen, which is a paddle that runs through from Fort William on the west coast of Scotland, and it goes up to Inverness on the east coast, which some people do that as a one-day race or a 2-day race. That's certainly not my goal. I don't consider myself to be an expert stand-up paddleboarder or an elite athlete. I'm just enjoying doing what I'm doing. So I intend to make that 100-kilometre trip perhaps a 4-day trip. I'm going to pop my tent and my sleeping bag on the front of the SUP board and, just take my time and, hopefully enjoy some nice weather and take in some beautiful scenery.
Amazing. And what about your must-see or your recommended locations in Europe and Middle East and further afield?
I think one of the most beautiful places that I've paddled in Europe was the Algarve in Portugal. There's some beautiful paddles that you can do along the sea there, on the cliffs, and there are various caves that you can go into. And one of my earliest paddle adventures abroad, I was actually in Portugal for a holiday, and I booked a trip from a place called Armaçao de Perro with someone who ran a company called Algarve SUP at the time. His name was Nick, and I think you might know.
I think I might know of him, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was one of my earliest paddles abroad, and if you like paddling in beautiful landscapes and beautiful locations, but the weather's very hot and the sun's beating down on you, then I don't think you could go too far wrong with the Algarve in Portugal.
So in terms of your strangest experience, have you had any sort of strange or bizarre experiences in the countries you visited?
Yeah, I've had quite a number of strange experiences, Simon. I don't know if I'll have time to share them all with you, but I think the very most bizarre one of all was when I was on the trip we spoke about earlier on up to Hammerfest at the top of Norway. And I was travelling up through Sweden and Finland, and I was well inside the Arctic Circle at this point, and I just sort of put my tent up. I was wild camping somewhere in the middle of the wilderness, and I was at the side of a river called the Torn River, which runs along the border between Finland and Sweden. Yeah, I really was in the middle of nowhere. I'd taken a look at the river and thought, I wonder if I can paddle on this, but I decided it was too dangerous. There was too much white water, too many rapids. There were tiny shallow parts where I thought my fin would get stuck, and that I'd be thrown off the board and injure myself. So I decided not to do it, but I put my tent up at the side of the river. And I stopped to take a selfie photograph of myself with the river behind me because, as I'm sure everyone knows, if there's no photograph on Facebook these days, then the thing never happened at all. So I took this photograph, and it wasn't cold, but it was starting to get a little bit chilly. So I'd put the hood of my hoodie up over my head, and then a waterproof jacket over my head as well, partly to ward off the cold. And partly to sort of ward off the mosquitoes that were starting to come out. And I had about 10 days worth of beard growth on my face as well. When I took the photograph, I felt really proud, like a real explorer in the middle of nowhere, a sort of stand-up paddleboarding version of Scott of the Antarctic. Yeah. And I've still got that photo. It's one of my proudest photographs. And just as I sort of put my selfie stick away, from round the corner in the river, I began to hear a sort of dull thud, thud, thud sound. And I thought, what on earth's that? It was a strange noise. I hoped it wasn't some indigenous people that were coming to capture me or something. And then just round the bend in the river, the river that I think's in the middle of the wilderness and is too dangerous to paddle, round that river comes a huge, pink, inflatable flamingo. With 3 people on it. There's a man and a woman at each side in the front holding a paddle, propelling it down the river. And there's another man sitting in the back, drinking a can of beer. They've got a sound system on there with some sort of Europop pounding out, which was the sound I'd heard. So it made me realise, my definition of being a brave explorer in the wilderness probably wasn't the same as those 3 local people. So
that's fantastic. Those flamingos get everywhere, don't they?
They certainly do. So if I ever go back to Finland, I might leave my paddleboard at home and just take a flamingo with me.
There you go. I mean, the other thing that I've seen quite a lot on social media is people on paddleboards dressed as dinosaurs. That's it's getting definitely a bit more bizarre out there.
Yeah, isn't it? I've seen that a few times. I haven't tried it yet, but I would never say never.
Absolutely. Maybe I mean, there's so many different elements of the sport. There's maybe a dinosaur one. Maybe we could launch that, John.
That sounds like a plan. Yeah, dinosaur the world, or Sup the dinosaur or something.
Perfect. Sounds amazing. So, I mean, obviously, as we mentioned at the start, things have been somewhat reduced by the current pandemic that's hitting the world, and you're obviously using that opportunity to paddle a lot more in the UK and weigh up your potential trips over to France. But when the whole thing's finished and merged out the other side, what are your plans? Where would be your first destination when we finally get the green light to head out, wherever we do in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a very strange year this year, and I've had a few plans that they maybe weren't definite plans, but I have a list of things that I might like to do, and they've all basically been cancelled. And I think, although my goal to paddle in every country in the world, absolutely remains a goal, I think when we start venturing a little bit further abroad, I think I'm likely to want to stay fairly close to home at the moment, just in case, and I've got that possible paddle in the Dordogne that I mentioned. I've also got my eye on a river in Czechia, the Czech Republic, which is called the Baronka or Baronka. I'm not too sure how you pronounce it. That looks like a multi-day paddle that you could again do the entire length of the river over 4 days as a a camping trip. So if I do get abroad this year, I think it's likely to be Czechia and France. But that doesn't stop my goals to go further afield. I've never visited South America. I'd love to spend a few weeks in South America paddling some of the countries there. I think it would be an absolutely fantastic adventure. Again, Africa, there's a huge big continent there of Africa, and there's a lot of countries there that I absolutely want to paddle in, and I think some of them will be, safer places to visit than others, but I'm very much looking forward to that. But at the very top of my hit list, Simon, somewhere I would absolutely love to go and paddle, and I'm determined that I will one day, is North Korea.
Yes, wow. And there have been people paddleboarding. I remember reading an article about someone who went and paddled there. So they're no strangers to that. But yeah, that would be quite something, wouldn't it?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I think it's possible to go anywhere and paddle, and yeah, North Korea. I think it's the one place people mention when I say I'm going to paddle in every country. They mention North Korea, so that sounds like a pretty good reason to go. For me, I am that kind of person. If you set me a challenge or if you tell me I can't do something, then to me that's a damn good reason to go and do it.
I mean, we haven't even touched on a lot of the amazing places you've paddled, particularly around Eastern Europe. So maybe we'll have you back for another session.
Yeah, I'd be absolutely honoured to come back, Simon. I've got so many fascinating places that I've visited, and so many great stories to tell. Well, they're great stories for me because I was there anyway. Hopefully, the listeners will enjoy hearing some of them.
Oh, I've been massively entertained, John. Thanks ever so much for your time. Really appreciate you sharing your time and sharing your experiences with us. Whereabouts can we find you online?
Yeah, before I answer that, Simon, just thank you for inviting me on. It's been an absolute honour to be here, and I'm absolutely honoured that anyone's invested their time in listening to this episode. I would also love it if people would like to sort of follow my adventures in the future. And the place I'm most active is somewhere called Facebook. I'm sure everyone's heard of Facebook, and I'm on Facebook as SUP the World. So that's just SUPTHEWORLD. So facebook.com/SUP the World. I'm also on Instagram, and my Instagram handle is SUP_the_world. And I do have a blog. I'm a little bit embarrassed to point people in the direction of my blog because I haven't kept it up to date. I think the most recent blog entry is from a couple of years ago, but I do have a goal to put that right over the rest of this coming year and catch up on some missing blog posts. So if anyone wants to also make their way to www.suptheworld.com, you'll be able to check up on me on whether I have actually brought my blog up to date or not.
Brilliant. Thanks again for your time, John. And I will see you, it sounds like, on the Canal du Midi once all of this is blown over.
That sounds absolutely fantastic, Simon. I'd love to see you there.
Brilliant. Take care, John.
Thank you. Bye-bye.